All right, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you all for joining us for our internal webinar series. Our topic today is going to be misconceptions about global warming and climate change. And our presenters today are going to be Heather Dinon and Dr. Ryan Boyles out of North Carolina State University. And I'm going to turn it over to Heather to do a more in-depth intro of the two of them and the topic. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Matt. I think probably most of you on this webinar know who we are, but we work for the State Climate Office. We're very much applied climatologists. And today we thought we'd jump in and talk to you guys about some misconceptions. And a lot of this might be preaching to the choir, but we thought it was a worthwhile endeavor to sort of be prepared for talking about this if folks were to ask you about these things. And so we basically just wanted to take the opportunity to present an objective view of the current state of the science. So we'll go ahead and get started. Well, we thought a good place to start would be with some definitions. So global warming actually only refers to an increase in the average temperature of the globe over time. And in comparison, climate change is actually more location specific and refers to some changes in the weather patterns around the globe, and this could be in your averages or your temperature and precipitation extremes, etc. So what we've done, we've set up this presentation and we've kind of come up with some common misconceptions that we've heard just through our experience being climatologists. And we thought we'd share some of those and sort of kind of go through and clarify some of them. So the first misconception is that you might hear someone say there's no consensus. Well, the reality is that the peer-reviewed literature is very much in consensus on the increase in global average temperatures and their relative causes. However, the public is most likely not exposed to peer-reviewed literature on a daily basis. More often they're exposed to non-peer-reviewed literature, such as, different media outlets, whether it be TV, radio, etc., on the internet. And so those other non-peer-reviewed sources almost make it appear as if there is not a consensus. But in fact, again, the peer-reviewed literature is in consensus. So let me show you sort of some data to back this up. Here is the global land surface air temperature anomaly, or departure from the average value from 1961 to 1990. And what this is showing from about 1850 through 2010, we have 4 different data sets here, and you're basically just seeing over time an increasing trend over time, and it's across these 4 different data sets. There's also a group out of Berkeley that recently did a study, and they were kind of on the more denier side. They were scientists, but they're sort of like questioning some of the data sources and the accuracy of the data. So what they did was they went through and did a very robust QC on quality control on the data, and they actually came out with a trend that was very similar to these 4 data sets shown here. So I would say there is very much a consensus, again, in the peer-reviewed literature. And one important distinction here is that this is in the global level. Something we want to look into is how does this compare at, sort of the PINEMAP regional and more local levels. Well, it really depends on the variable that you're looking at, whether it be temperature or precipitation, and what location you are looking at. So that's just one important distinction. Here is just a slide depicting some of the different forcing components. You can see that CO2 is one of the major contributors here at the top. What I also like about this diagram, this is from the IPCC report, is that it shows the error bars associated with the different factors. Let me see if I can turn on the highlighter here. So you see the error bars, for example, with the CO2, it's a smaller error bar than, for example, the cloud albedo effect, which is a contributor, but you can see the error bar is huge on that, so it's one of the major sources of uncertainty. But we do have more confidence in the CO2 contribution portion of it. So a second misconception is that I've often heard someone say there's been cooling since 1998, so global warming's over. Well, in reality, it's really better to look at the longest period of record available in order to examine some trends. So let me just show you an example. Going back to this same graph I just showed, if you zoom in on the period here from 1975 to 2010, this is what you get. And 1998 here for the different data sets is highlighted. And 97-98 was one of the strongest El Niños on record, which is a contributing factor to this anomaly. There's also that underlying background trend, but that was, sort of contributing as well, the El Niño, that is. And if you sort of, I didn't put a trend line on this graph, but if you sort of visually just try and imagine a trend line on here with each of the different, using 1998 as your starting point, each of the different data sets, what you'll see is either no trend or a decreasing trend. And so that's where that comes from. But really just what you wanted to do is really look at the full period of record as often as possible to get really the full story and not just a piece of the puzzle.
Using trends can be really dangerous. A linear trend especially is very dangerous. It's entirely dependent on the start time and the end time of what you look at, and you can get very dramatic, very different results by just changing 1 or 2 years in there. And so we try to caution people from using linear trends, especially when looking at environmental data that has a lot of background variability in it. And you get a very different picture if you look at, say, just 1975 to present, versus even going back and looking at the full record from the late 1800s to present.
Okay, so moving on to misconception number 3. I have heard both versions of this. I've heard only natural processes are contributing to the warming, not humans. And conversely, I've also heard from the other side, only humans are contributing to the warming, not natural processes. But the reality of it is that both of them are driving the warming trend. And I'll show you that in this graph here, which is from the IPCC third assessment report. So in the top left here, again, we have your temperature departures from normal in Celsius, and the gray lines are always going to be the model results, and the red is always going to be your observations that you're comparing with. And the period here is, I think, around I think 1860 until 2000. And so what IPCC has done is gone in trying to run models to replicate sort of what we've seen in the observations in the past. So trying to basically just validate the models and see how well they're doing. And the graph on the top left is only using natural forcing, so your solar radiation and your contributions from volcanoes. And what you see here is that sometimes it's pretty close to observations, but not always, especially within the past, I'd say the recent past, in particular here, the past 30 years, I would say. And conversely, on the top right, you see only the anthropogenic forcing. So the models are run with only anthropogenic forcing, and you can see that most of the time, again, it matches up, particularly in this period here, they match pretty well, and then also in the recent 30 years, it's matching pretty well. But there's this period here where there's kind of a mismatch, and so basically the bottom graph here shows that the best match is when you include both of these forcings in the picture. It's not perfect, but no model is ever going to be perfect, I would argue. So let's see. And this is also just sort of another way of looking at it. This is a shorter period of record, so I will caveat it with that. It's only from, I guess, about mid-1970s to 2010, but that's because this is, the bottom plot is the solar energy output measured by satellites, and satellites didn't start recording until 1970, so this is the longest period of record that we actually have. And the top is just showing in comparison to the global surface temperature anomalies. And what you're seeing in the solar energy output is this 11-year kind of cyclical pattern. There's some variability mapped on there as well, but you don't see any trend to it across this period. Versus looking at the global surface temperatures, you do see a trend. And certainly the solar energy output is contributing to the surface. They're related, but it's not the only factor. There's something else going on because there's an underlying increasing trend in the data. So the fourth misconception is we've often heard everywhere in the world is going to warm equally. But this is not the case, and I'll show that here with a diagram. These are two scenarios, again, from the IPCC report. They've run coupled global climate models. The top scenario is A2, and the bottom scenario is B2. And really what I want you to pick out of this is that the southern hemisphere and the tropics are not going to be warming as much as, say, the Arctic regions. So a lot of the warming is going to be up here. And part of the reason why the Arctic is going to warm a lot is because there's sort of a positive feedback going on up there. So you have some warming, and the ice melts, and it changes your reflectivity. So the surface changes, and you actually get more absorption, which again leads to more warming, and so the cycle kind of just continues, and it's what we call positive feedback. The southern hemisphere is not going to warm as much because it's largely made up of the oceans, which have a higher heat capacity than the land does. There's that. So not everywhere is going to warm equally is sort of the point of this slide. Misconception number 5 is that carbon dioxide has natural fluctuations. Okay, that is entirely true, but humans are also contributing. And here's a time series going back 800,000 years using proxy data from an Antarctic ice core. So you can see some of the natural fluctuations across time here. But as we get to the recent record, for example, 2008, there's an observation here from Mauna Loa Observatory, and you can see, over the past, it's basically gone through these natural fluctuations, going from about 200 to 300 parts per million. But in 2008, it was close to 400, and it's projected to increase in the future based on the different emission scenarios. The lower end, it would be about 550 parts per million, and the higher emission scenario, it would be closer to 900 parts per million. So, and this is kind of just zooming in on the longest period of observational record we have for carbon dioxide concentrations, and this is again at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and it's from about 1958 until 2000. I guess 2008 is what this is showing, but they are still recording it. It's just not reflected on this graph here. But you can see the sort of the natural seasonal cycles in there, but also there's clearly an underlying trend as well. And one thing I will say about Mauna Loa is that it's really an ideal spot for measuring CO2 because it is basically away from large population centers. It's sort of in the middle of the ocean, so the CO2 is able to mix well, and so I would argue it's a pretty adequate site to to measure the CO2. So it's a pretty robust location.
It's also important to note that carbon dioxide is fairly well mixed in the atmosphere. There's not a huge difference from one location to another, especially given the background trend as to what the carbon dioxide levels are. One of the things you'll notice in this curve is the annual cycle of increase and decrease. And my guess is that everyone in this webinar understands what's causing that annual cycle. The big increases are in the cold season, when there's little vegetation, especially in the northern hemisphere. The decreases in the warm season, when there's more vegetation, trees and plants that are absorbing carbon dioxide from the air.
And this chart here is just depicting the relationship between temperature and CO2. So this is not new science. Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist, actually studied this relationship back in 1896. He did an experiment where he found for a doubling of CO2, he got anywhere between 3 and 6 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. So really this has been studied for a long, long time, but just wanted to show that particular relationship here. And the sixth misconception, I'm actually going to hand it over to Ryan to take over from here for the rest of the talk.
Yeah, so one of the greenhouse gases that's in the atmosphere is water vapor, and it's a naturally occurring greenhouse gas. And we sometimes get the argument, well, there's so much more water vapor in the air, why don't we ever argue about the amount of water vapor? Why don't we look at reducing global warming by reducing the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere? In reality, humans have very little impact on the amount of water vapor relatively that's in the air, because most of that water vapor comes from the oceans. So if we want to start draining the oceans substantially, we might start to impact, or somehow otherwise lock up the oceans, we might impact the amount of water vapor that's in the air. But it's not a substantial impact from humans. The other thing to recognize with water vapor is it cycles through the atmosphere on the order of days, estimates from 4 to 6 days. Water vapor will evaporate and then recondense and fall back to the earth. Carbon dioxide, methane, some of the other greenhouse gases that get a lot of attention are resident in the atmosphere on the order of hundreds of years. And so while we could take some measures and show some short-term impacts from water vapor and remove it from the air, it's going to cycle back up very quickly. The greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that we're putting into the atmosphere now, the other things we're doing to impact the environment that have much longer-term effects and are probably a longer-term contributor to climate variability and climate change over the long term than what happens with water vapor. And coming back to methane, we do get this question a lot too. Why is methane a concern? It's such a small concentration in the atmosphere. We're talking about 1.8 parts per million. So it's a very tiny amount of gas in the atmosphere. However, it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. In the atmosphere, it absorbs a lot more outgoing radiation. It prevents a lot more radiation and heat from leaving the Earth and absorbs it and traps it in the atmosphere. So we get a lot of concern about methane because it's a much more potent, much more powerful greenhouse gas and can have, therefore, a more substantial impact per unit than even carbon dioxide. Another one we get from some folks is this perception that greenhouse gases and greenhouse effect are all bad. And that's not really true. In fact, we are benefiting very much from having at least a reasonable amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. The carbon dioxide that's in there, as well as some of these other trace greenhouse gases like methane, keep the surface of the Earth about 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it otherwise would be. The real problem is when we start thinking about excess amounts of greenhouse gases, going well beyond the natural cycle. We're talking about tripling the natural cycle here in the next 100 years of greenhouse gases, and that is going to lead to a much, much warmer atmosphere. Now, there are even those who say, legitimately, in some cases, that so we let the greenhouse gases concentration go up. Maybe we just need to deal with the weather that's going to come. Indeed, for many colder climates, they're going to become much warmer. Areas of, if it goes unchecked over the next 100 years, areas of Canada, of Central Asia, Siberia, are going to become very habitable. They are going to become breadbaskets. and going to be able to produce a lot of vegetation, a lot of trees that otherwise they couldn't do right now. However, for most of us where we live, we're going to start to experience some climate conditions that may be challenging for us to deal with. And that's why this argument is back and forth. There are those who say we shouldn't do anything about it, we should just adapt and deal with the climate that's going to come. There are others who say no, we have to do everything to prevent that climate from occurring. You know, as a physical scientist, I don't get into those arguments so much on the policy side. What we try to do is inform those things so that they can plan appropriately and have a better understanding of what the consequences will be for either policy approach. Related to this, we did get the questions just like before that the question was that humans are contributing to the warming or only natural processes are contributing to the warming. The other question we often get is, wow, these greenhouse gases are really what's causing everything. And it's not the only answer, especially when you get to local level climate, like what's happening across the southeast. Changes in our land use and our land cover patterns have a huge impact. Indeed, most of the warming that we've seen, especially in the urban areas over the past 30 years in the South, is largely due to the changes in land use. As we build up cities, as we change what would otherwise be naturally vegetated areas and put in street and concrete and lots of air conditioning systems and cars, we are changing the local climate, the local radiative forces that determine the local climate. And we can largely see, especially in much of the southeast, as you move away from the urban areas, especially in the deeper parts of the South, Alabama, parts of Georgia, Mississippi, you actually see some cooling in some of the longer-term trends over the past 30 to 60 years. But in the urban areas, you still see warming, especially in the minimum temperatures. So the reality is, and this is why the IPCC reports to anthropogenic forces, all human forces collectively, is because we're not entirely sure what percentage is greenhouse gases and what percentage is urbanization at the local level, but we know that both are contributing. Okay, so this is the other one we get from both sides. X event is proof that global warming does not exist, or X event is the proof that global warming does exist. We've got a couple of examples here. Ones we've heard recently. Here in North Carolina, we had a very cold winter 2 winters ago, the coldest in 30 years, and there was a big snowfall, Snowmageddon up in D.C., and we heard it coming out of it, oh gosh, this is just proof that there's no global warming. What a bunch of nonsense. Last year we had a tornado roll through, and a respected colleague, someone that we respect at a national conference, used that as evidence of global warming. Both of them are absolutely wrong. It is extremely difficult to attribute any single event entirely to global warming. We can do some very complex modeling studies and look at attributing specific fractions of an event to global warming. So it might be that the snowfall, the Snowmageddon up in D.C., 10% of it might have been due to global warming. And same thing for the Raleigh tornado. A very small fraction of the fact that the tornado just happened to come through Raleigh instead of 20 miles east might have been a fraction of it, very small fraction, 1-2%, might have been due to the background warming. But the reality is that none of these can be directly attributed to global warming. One of the things that we sort of are expecting to see based on observational studies as well as modeling studies is how the weather and the climate pattern is going to shift. And a good way to look at that is the distribution of the types of events. What we have up here is the distribution of extreme temperatures across any given region. And there are three types of things that we could expect to see. One of them is a shift in the means, where the entire distribution shifts to the warm side. This is actually not what we expect. Based on our understandings of the dynamics in the climate, we wouldn't necessarily expect just the entire shape to shift and maintain its distribution shape and shift to the warm side. Another way to look at it would be just a shift in the variability in the shape of the distribution. In this example here, you would still have more hot weather, more extreme hot weather. You might see more cold weather, more extreme cold weather. In this case, the mean stays the same. What you get is a shift in the variability only. What we think is more likely to happen is to have a shift in the symmetry where there's likely to be a shift in the mean, but there's also going to be a shift in the variability. And both of those could lead to more extreme conditions in some locations, maybe just more extreme warm events in some locations, but not extreme cold events. We might have fewer extreme cold events and more extreme warm events. Any combination of these can happen on any given location because of how the dynamics of the climate might change locally. Another misconception that I've been dealing with a lot recently, especially in the media, is the recent USDA plant hardiness zone maps. They are evidence of climate change. Well, not really. They kind of are and they kind of aren't. And one of the critical factors here is looking at the way the data was used and the time duration of the data. So one of the things to point out in the old map is that they use 15 years of data, basically. Excuse me, not even 15 years of data. They use, 12 years of data. Whereas the most recent map uses a much longer period of record that's in theirs. And so if you simply look at a larger sample, you're going to naturally expect to see some shifts, because we know now that a 15-year period is not representative of the long-term climate variability. So by going to a longer-term period of record in the new one that goes from 76 to 2005, we do have more confidence in the data that it's representative of what the longer-term pattern is going to be. However, it also represents the warming that has occurred over the past 30 years. In the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s were some of the coldest in the past 100 years, whereas the past decade has been one of the warmer decades in the past 100 years. So it does represent the shift that's observed over the past 30 years, but is not necessarily representative of true long-term climate change at a local scale. Another misconception we get, especially when we start talking about models, and certainly Heather and I, and maybe me more so than Heather, are huge critics of models and the way climate models are used. But we do get this question that comes up, and it happened just a couple weeks ago at a community presentation I was giving. You know, you can't get a decent weather forecast for a few days from now. How can you possibly get a climate forecast 100 years from now? Well, the models are not expected to do the same things. With a climate model, we're not trying to predict the weather 100 years from now. We're not trying to predict what the high temperature is going to be on March 16th in 2050. We're trying to predict what the range of temperatures is likely to be during the decades of the 2050s in the spring season. So it's a very different type of answer that we're looking for in the climate models. The climate models work in a very different way than weather models do. Weather models are trying to predict what's happening in the short period, and they keep the ocean steady, they keep the vegetation steady, and they're really just trying to predict the atmosphere. This is a schematic that shows some of the differences. Let me have the. I'll let you look at this and and read through it real quick while I get the computer flipped around here and get a cursor set up so that I can manipulate it. So what you see here is, I'm going to switch. What you see here is really where the climate models were in the 1970s. And you see how they've gotten increasingly complex over the past 30 years. Mid-1980s, the atmospheric and land surface models, and this is basically where weather models are still today. They simulate the land surface, and they simulate the atmosphere. And that's it. Climate models are also trying to simulate changes in ocean and sea ice concentrations and how they will evolve year after year, month after month over the next 100 years. They look at changes in atmospheric aerosols. They include the carbon cycle. They dynamically change the vegetation in response to the changing climate. And they have atmospheric chemistry introductions as well. So the climate models are far more complex and have to account for a lot more processes, and which is why one of our limiting factors for climate models is simply the computer power that we have. Even with the most powerful computers we have these days, we're using the most powerful computers we have to do the climate simulations, and they're still grossly insufficient. We figure it's going to be at least another 15 years before we can try and resolve the type of simulations that we need if computing power continues to double about every 18 months. Okay, another one, climate models have lots of uncertainty and can't be trusted. Well, it depends on how they're used. And if you're trying to use a climate model to predict, especially a global climate model, to predict what's going to happen in Raleigh or Gainesville or Auburn, certainly you would be inappropriate to use that. The models aren't designed to do that, and you certainly wouldn't want to use that model to give you guidance as to what is going to happen in the future. I would not trust such a data set. Global climate models are never going to be able to perfectly reproduce a single weather event in the future. But they they generally handle the broad climate patterns over the past, and therefore give us some confidence as what's going to happen into the future, especially at continental and global scales. Where we're pushing the science now, where we're pushing the computing now, is to try and get us down finer and finer scales where we can actually simulate with confidence climate processes at the state regional scales instead of just adequately representing those at the continental and global scales. This is what we mean by the ability of climate models. We're looking at global patterns. They tend to capture the general pattern, not perfectly, but fairly well. When you start getting down to local areas, you see the models have a much bigger range of variations here. This red here is sort of the global model that's out there that's using a range of global models that are being used. This is sort of the envelope of solutions that they come through all the mathematics. Climate models work on physical relationships, physical mathematical equations that have been derived from in some cases, centuries of observation. So we understand the core physics of the atmosphere. One of the problems is we're unable to truly simulate those at the local scales because we lack the computing power to handle all of the different complexities. But the models do a decent job of capturing the general ups and downs in global temperature. When we start getting down to North America, they still do a decent job. We start looking specifically at, say, the southeastern United States, they start to struggle a little bit more. And in particular, the models all predict warming in recent years that hasn't been observed yet. And these are still areas that we have active research going in. These are the types of things that climatologists argue about. What are the relative forcings at local levels? What are the other processes that we need to simulate at very local levels? These are where we get together in our big conferences and bore other people to tears arguing about relative forcings. But there's really very little disagreement, and there's really only a handful of folks that are not necessarily doing active research right now that think that there is no global warming. Okay, so what's the point of all this? One of the perspectives, especially when I talk to community groups, is we don't argue. There are all these misconceptions about the warming, but it really doesn't matter to some extent. One of the things we need to think about is not so much what climatologists argue about, whether the globe is going to warm 3 degrees more or whether it's going to warm 2.5 degrees warm, but whether we're going to argue on what the impacts of this warming is going to be. And as a society, and for the PINEMAP project in particular, and for a lot of the folks that you're going to be talking to, that's where the interest is. What are the impacts going to be? Now, this is a whole other area of uncertainty. While we have confidence in the global forecasts, we don't necessarily have confidence in all the areas of local impacts. Just like the global models can't necessarily predict what's going to happen at a very local level, we don't have a whole lot of confidence in exactly what the sea level rise is going to be at Miami-Dade County, or exactly what the shift in pine species are going to be, or the frequency of southern pine beetle outbreaks. We know these things have linkages to climate, and we can use the longer-term climate guidance and what's happened in the past to help inform us. There is going to be uncertainty. But all of these things that we're talking about now in some ways have happened in the past, and we can very much utilize that historical record that we have to give us guidance as to the type of events that can happen into the future. So here are some examples, and I challenge any of you to think of some disasters that could happen in the future in the southeastern United States that haven't happened in the past that are going to have impacts to the PINEMAP region and to the type of research that you're doing. We experience all of this already. We have lots of observations and lots of relationships that have already been established from history that can help us understand what the likely impacts in the future are going to be. That said, there is this background climate change that's going to occur, and there are these changes that are going to happen. We have a sense of what some of these changes are going to be, but as much as anything, we need to be educating our users and making them aware of what is likely to happen into the future so that they can at least be aware and can plan appropriately. With that, all these misconceptions that are out there, these are not things that the climate scientists argue about. What are the things that we do argue about? We've talked about the sensitivity of the climate system. How sensitive is it going to be? At what point do we reach tipping points? Are we getting to a point where, for example, we're going to, no matter what we do, reduce the sea ice in the Arctic and have that positive feedback that Heather alluded to earlier? Exactly what amount of warming that's been observed is due to local land use changes, is due to increases in CO2, is due to changes in methane concentrations. What are the relative contributions of those along with soot in the atmosphere, black carbon, the aerosols that are in the atmosphere that have reflective capabilities. All of these things are out there. These are the details that we argue about at these meetings that would probably bore some of you to tears. We also are very much focused on what the changes in the extremes are going to be locally. And of course, these are the areas where we have a lot of the most uncertainty and where we really want to push the sciences so we can give better certainty and better guidance to all the folks that are going to be sensitive to it. Impacts, cost benefits, you see some of these things. These are where a lot of the climate scientists have our rather strong arguments, and that's even before we get into the policy world of what should be done about it. So with that, we'll end the formal seminar, and we'll open it up to any questions that you might have. And we've put some questions up here to sort of get things started. But I want to open it up to the full audience first and see if there are any pending questions that are out there. Thank you.